Well, greetings, everyone. My name is Tim Chandler, and I work on the Church and Ministry Alliance team here at ADF. And I am so glad that you have decided to join us for this conversation that we're going to have today on navigating faith and politics as a ministry leader. And at the outset, I just want to say the purpose of our webinar is not to push churches to engage in political activity in a particular way or tell them what they need to do in that space, because we understand every church is different. Every congregation is different. Every political environment and election cycle is different. There's not a one-size-fits-all answer to these types of questions. But rather, our goal today is to really provide you some insights and some resources that we hope will be helpful for you as you navigate and develop a biblical perspective on these issues regarding the political season that we're in. We want to empower you to understand the culture and political moment that we're dealing with. We also really want to help you remove any uncertainty that you may have regarding the legal issues surrounding church and politics. Because if your church feels called to address a particular issue on a matter that touches on politics, we want you to have the clarity and the courage and the certainty to be able to address it without fear of crossing any of the legal lines of what you can do and what you can't do. Ultimately, we want your church to freely proclaim God's truth, no matter where that truth may lead. And we at ADF are here to serve you and to help you in whatever way we can to fulfill your mission as the church and proclaim the truth to our culture. So with that, we're going to dive right in. And I am so thankful to be joined today by my colleague, Don Zeal. Don is our Senior Vice President of the Church and Ministry Alliance and the Assistant General Counsel here at Alliance Defending Freedom. And we're also joined today by Dr. Andrew Walker from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, where he is an Associate Professor of Christian Ethics and Public Theology. He's also the Associate Dean of the School of Theology and the Director of the Carl F. H. Henry Institute for Evangelical Engagement. In addition to all that, he also serves as a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. So thank you guys for being here. Andrew, let's dive right in with you.
Sure.
I think we should define our terms.
Yeah.
How should we define politics as we're thinking about these questions?
Sure. So when we hear the term politics, what usually comes to mind is, are you of Fox News or are you of MSNBC? So we typically defer automatically to punditry, which politics necessarily includes elements of punditry, but it's a much bigger process and task and project. To think about politics really is asking the question of, how do we organize our lives together? We live in a fallen world where there are a lot of different opinions, different beliefs about ultimate matters. And so people are going to approach those answers from varying perspectives, and there's disagreements. And that means amidst that disagreement, we have to figure out, how do we order our lives within a political community to manage that disagreement in such a way that everyone can prosper to the maximal way possible. I would think even dialing this out, we think about this from a biblical worldview. I would root politics in something like the cultural mandate that we have from Genesis chapter 1, when we're called to exercise dominion. Exercising dominion is basically us stepping outside of our homes, figuring out how to make society work and run reasonably. And again, politics includes voting, but politics is about how we're going to arrange our laws for the sake of everyone's prospering and their flourishing. So things like streetlights are actually deeply political. When you go to the store and you hand your debit card to buy something and you have the reasonable expectation you're going to get that debit card back and you're going to walk out the door with that good, you're relying upon laws that are allowing you to engage in commerce. All of those laws are made by human beings that have a conscience. And those consciences are being shaped in the direction of truth, or they're being shaped in the direction of error. And so every single person, it doesn't matter if you don't think of yourself as political, I'm here to tell you, you actually are political because you are someone with a conscience. You're someone who wants to figure out how to live their life in a meaningful way in a diverse society. That means that you have a vested stake in politics. So just to simplify, it's how do we live our lives together? That's what politics is.
Right. And so looking at it through that lens, because a lot of times people say, the Bible doesn't really deal with politics.
Sure.
But if in the way that you're defining it, it definitely changes the way that you think about Christians and their role and maybe obligations towards engaging in politics, because the Bible has a lot to say about how we interact as human beings.
Right. No, absolutely. So, this is why, as evangelicals and Protestants, sometimes we talk about this language of creation ordinances that we see from Genesis 1 and 2. What do you have in Genesis 1 and 2 pop up? You have this idea of our existence matters as human beings. So life implicitly matters and has meaning to it. The idea that you are male and female, that matters. The idea that you would be brought into this world through a family matters. So marriage matters. And then when you think about what politics is geographically, political communities are really just the sum total of all of the families living in a particular geographic boundary. And they're figuring out how to order their lives together. So the Christian worldview speaks emphatically to the issue of politics because politics speaks about what it means to be human. If we think that there is a Christian understanding of what it means to be human, it means necessarily that we're going to have to be engaged in politics, because so much of what is happening today in the political arena, it's not just debating sugar subsidies and speed limits, it's debating these kind of first tier order creation principles of what does it mean to be a human? Do human beings have a right to life? What is a man or a woman? What is a family? And so, one of the things I like to say here is one of the reasons that our politics is religious in nature today is because our religion is necessarily political as far as the kind of the core convictions that we have from Genesis that then spin their way out into how we live our lives in societies with one another.
Right. So, and it's certainly understandable, especially in the current political climate that we're in, that there are times when pastors can be maybe a bit reluctant to enter into discussions or preach sermons or whatever that cover issues that would be labeled as political in our culture. Yeah. So that reticence can be understandable. Sure. But so in light of that, in thinking about everything you just laid out, how would you describe the sort of appropriate situations where a pastor may want to or maybe even should consider preaching about or otherwise addressing issues that could be labeled political?
Sure, and I want to address the reticence thing for just a second. It's funny, the outside secular world would have this kind of assumption that if you're a pastor and you're an evangelical, that you're just frothing at the mouth, wanting to talk about politics all the time. Statistically, that's not even true. We know that across the board when you compare evangelicals to the rest of the population. But I think we also want to establish here that, pastors have an obligation to hit on those areas that we would consider political when they kind of move into those, what I would call creation order principles. So this doesn't mean that I think a pastor needs to be talking about, let's do a very practical example. I'm very much in favor of educational choice, vouchers systems. I don't think that that's an area that a pastor has biblical warrant to necessarily jump in and preach on immediately. But educational systems are different than this more fundamental question of what does it mean to be a human being. I think we need to recognize that our politics in the United States today is not just political. It's deeply theological. And so pastors, by default, are going to have to find themselves weighing in on issues that maybe 50 years ago they wouldn't want to be weighing in on. I can think of just one example here. There was a pastor in my denomination of a very large church who doesn't really get involved in politics really at all. And I think commendably, I don't think pastors need to be involved in politics every single Sunday. But I remember there was a marriage amendment being voted upon in this particular state. This was a long time ago, and this pastor released a video and said, "Hey, church, this is your pastor speaking. We don't really get involved in politics that much. The problem is this issue, this issue of debating what marriage is, it bleeds into the areas that are absolutely front and center to the biblical worldview. So you know me, I don't weigh into politics all the time, but sometimes I do need to wade into politics. And we're here to tell you that we think you should vote for this amendment that would define marriage as the union of one man and one woman. Not because this is about seeking Christian privilege only, but we're thinking about ordering society according to the most foundational unit that there is for society, which is the family. So I think what pastors need to ask themselves is whenever an issue is being debated in society, ask yourself, does the church or does the pastor have the mandate? Do they have the competency? Do they have the jurisdiction to weigh in on that issue? And where it hits Scripture directly, you absolutely have the license to jump in there. Again, I don't think pastors should be talking about sugar subsidies, things, really granular public policies like that, or even necessarily what the best tax system is necessarily. I think Christians can reasonably disagree on what the best tax systems are. We can't disagree about what it means to be a human, what it means to be male and female, what the nature of the family is. And so I think that rather than being reticent, I think pastors should understand, by and large, they're not going to need to be weighing in on politics all the time, but sometimes you will need to weigh in on politics, and not to be fearful when that time happens, because you're recognizing that I'm actually not weighing in on politics. I'm weighing in on theological matters that hits on politics.
Well, Don, that seems like a really good time to bring you into this discussion, because even with this perspective where, we identify times where it is perfectly appropriate and maybe even necessary for these topics to come up in the church, pastors may have a lot of questions about or concerns about what they're allowed to do legally, and are they going to get in trouble? And I think there's a lot of misunderstandings out there. What are the common misperceptions that you see in your role among churches and ministry leaders as far as the rules and regulations in this area?
Yeah, I think I'll start a little bit where Andrew was on this reticence. It's a real thing. We experience it with the pastors that we interact with the church leaders, and with the congregants, the people who are going to church. I think one of the misconceptions or maybe misunderstandings is I think pastors, church leaders, congregants tend to accept the prevailing definitions when they go into these things. But I think it's incredibly helpful to start where we started. But I'll just give an example. You probably have heard a pastor say, well, we really can't get into that because it's a political issue. Mm-hmm. Or we've heard a congregant hear something like that like you just described in the story about the pastor, and they say, well, I didn't understand this church was political when I decided to come here this morning. And I think partly that's sort of accepting a definition of political activities and what people consider political, and sort of letting the secular world define that for the church, instead of the church coming out and saying, walking through the thought process that Andrew walked us through. Like, what is a biblical mandate? What are the things that come out of that creative order narratives that the church needs to be speaking on? Quite simply, in the law, the definition of political activity is probably much more narrow than a lot of people think. Right? We were typically talking about influencing legislation, and we're talking about participating or intervening in a political election. That's kind of where the law covers. We'll talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the law and how that applies. So I think that idea, like just taking the word political and the connotations that takes, that's something I think the church can take back a little bit.
Yeah.
You can say, no, we get to define what that means, infidelity to the mission God has called us to.
Yeah.
So the other thing, I think I put this in the same category as sort of misunderstanding of terms. We throw around the term separation of church and state a lot. It's not an entirely unhelpful term. It's not a constitutional term. It certainly is one that we've used as shorthand to kind of capture the spirit of the Establishment Clause. But I think sometimes the interpretation of that means that the church is supposed to somehow withdraw from public engagement. It's supposed to stay away from that. There's a wall here. The Thomas Jefferson quote from the letter to the Danbury Baptist has stuck with us. There's the wall there. And I think we, as a church, sometimes give heed to that without actually thinking through the implications and what the Establishment Clause means, how the Establishment Clause is currently being interpreted by courts. And there's a lot of interest in trying to make that a very strong separation. And I think sometimes churches tend to not engage in that discussion and just accept it on the premise. So those are a couple, I think, things on misunderstanding of terms. The other thing I would point out in terms of just misconceptions is I think sometimes probably because of the things we just talked about of definitional confusion, that church leaders, pastors, congregants, they kind of let the tail wag the dog a little bit. When they think about political activity, they first think, and maybe partly this is because when we're talking to them, they're coming to lawyers, but they're saying, well, what does the law say about this? And I think I think it's important legal principle. I think it's also an important theological principle is don't start your questions about the law and then work backwards. Yeah. Start your questions and establish a convictional strategy on these things. What does your church? How does your church interpret render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's? What has God uniquely called your church to do in preaching and teaching and discipleship? Start there, and then honestly, and we'll talk about what the law says specifically about a few things. But I think a lot of churches aren't going to come very close to the line where they're going to be doing prohibited activities under the law. Some will, and then you can work through how the law applies to the activities that you're involved in. But I think it really needs to start with going through some of the concepts that Andrew raised and thinking through what has God called us to as an organization? How are we supposed to engage? What is the message we've been entrusted to bring in our context and in our culture?
Yeah, and I think you hit on a good point there in terms of misconceptions, even going back to the Thomas Jefferson letter, how much that has been distorted from its original intent. When he wrote that, it was to assure the church that the government would stay out of the church's affairs. The wall of separation was to protect the church from the government, not to say the church should not be speaking into matters of public concern or matters of politics. Yeah. And I think understanding the true meaning of that phrase kind of speaks into everything else you said, which is the church needs to figure out what it believes and what its calling is and what its mission is, and to pursue that in a way knowing that the law is really set up to protect it from the government. And I think there's still a lot of truth in that. I mean, there are some limitations, and we'll talk about those, but churches have a lot of freedom in this space and really should be speaking into them where they feel called to, and don't need to feel too much too limited by the legal principles that we're going to talk about. So let's dive into that a little bit now.
Sure.
And when you started describing this initially, you mentioned you made a bit of a distinction between sort of political questions or political or like legislative matters and political candidates specifically, and that there are some unique rules surrounding endorsing or opposing candidates, and that starts obviously with what's called the Johnson Amendment, which is a federal law governing that space. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what does the Johnson Amendment say and how does it impact churches?
Sure. The Johnson Amendment is sort of the elephant in the room when you're talking about these type of issues, and when you're an interesting law when you just get known by shorthand. You're not 501c3 code. This is the Johnson Amendment. So, but it's important to understand the history, where it sits on the books, and how it relates to all nonprofit organizations, and then specifically we can talk about churches and religious organizations. But in short, the Johnson Amendment was passed in 1954. It was an amendment to the what we often refer to as 501c3. It's an amendment to the Internal Revenue Code, and it's an interesting history. There's a lot of debate about the Johnson Amendment. We can talk a little bit about that. And in a lot of the debate, you sort of hear, well, the people who really support and want to see a greater enforcement of the Johnson Amendment sort of have this narrative about the history of how this is protecting the political arena and protecting the arena of nonprofit and charitable organizations. The reality is the history, we really don't know a lot about the history of the Johnson Amendment. It's called the Johnson Amendment. It was passed or was introduced by Senator Lyndon Johnson, who went on to become the president. And he had just actually gone through an election where his opponent had utilized funding through 501c3 nonprofit organizations. And so then he introduced an amendment. So the amendment itself was political in its birth. There's not really much legislative history on it. There wasn't actually much debate. There's actually a voice vote, and it became part of the code since 1954. It was updated in 1987 to add a section. I'll explain that. But in essence, it's 31 words that deal with the definition of what it means to be a tax-exempt organization. A tax-exempt organization is an organization that is exempt from taxes, and then in this case also enjoys charitable deductions for its donors. And so these benefits are available to the certain types of organizations that are described in the code, except for organizations, and then it has a couple caveats that includes the Johnson Amendment, except for organizations which participate or intervene in a political campaign in support or opposition to a candidate. So that's the Johnson Amendment in short. The or oppose was added in 1987. So it said to support a candidate, they added or oppose. And the reality is, so that it really does two things. One, it keeps charities, and again, this is when we talk about the Johnson Amendment, this applies to all charities that fall under this type of tax exempt organization, churches among them. But it keeps those organizations from being able to fund campaigns, to being able to pass money through to a candidate. It keeps charities from being able to explicitly endorse candidates for office. Those are the two main functions of the Johnson Amendment. And of course, as it relates to churches, a lot of the controversy has really come from that second effect, which is, and particularly a pastor who feels compelled to, in his religious duties to his congregants, tell them about his convictions on voting for a specific candidate. This is prohibited by the Johnson Amendment, and the criticism of the Johnson Amendment is this moves into violation of speech and religious protections of pastors. So how it relates to the church is on this question of our churches being censored. Our church is not able to give the counsel they would normally give that flows from their religious conviction because of this prohibition in the Internal Revenue Code through the Johnson Amendment.
Right. So bottom line, it says no opposing or endorsing political candidates. And, it is interesting to see there hasn't been, because you mentioned there's a censorship component to this, right? Like they're prohibiting, pastors from being able to speak in their official capacities at church on these. And yet we don't see a lot of litigation about it because there's not a lot of enforcement. So there's that question out there. Anything you have to say about that and what the IRS is doing with regard to the Johnson Amendment?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. One, probably the most prominent case was a case in 1992 that involved a church that had placed an ad in a newspaper opposing the candidate for president at the time, who became President Clinton. And there was enforcement in that. The church challenged it on First Amendment grounds, and it was in the circuit court. It didn't get beyond that, and the court upheld the Johnson Amendment in that case. But it also found that one of the reasons it didn't side with the church on its First Amendment claims is because the court reasoned that that there were other avenues by which a church could pursue that type of endorsement. And by other avenues, there's other avenues in the tax code. And in that case, there are other types of organizations. We won't get into the details. There are 501c4 organizations, which are tax-exempt organizations, but don't have charitable deductions for their donors. And so that's what the court said at the time. But that was 1992. So that tells you a little bit that enforcement hasn't been very robust. There is often there's spirited debate over the Johnson Amendment about how to fix it. There's people that say it doesn't need to be fixed; it just needs to be enforced more. But it is not something that is been strictly enforced or enforced in every instance where it might have been. At the same time, it's still I still think it's a good debate. It's a great question to ask if a law like this should sit on the books as it is written. But yeah, that tells you a little bit about where the enforcement of it has been.
So even if we take it at face value, let's just talk through a couple of the implications there. Does that mean, because there's a long history in our country of political candidates speaking at churches. Yeah. Does the Johnson Amendment prohibit churches from being able to have candidates speak at their services? So
the other thing that's happened over the years with the Johnson Amendment is the IRS has been asked to clarify on different levels. One thing I should also point out, this probably goes in the misconception category that could have been another one in answer to that question, but you see in other parts of the world where you see where pastors are censored, pastors are jailed. Yeah. This is a different kind of law. This is about tax exemption. We can talk about the purpose of tax exemption, the value of tax exemption in our society. That's a different webinar probably. But remember, the Johnson Amendment is aimed at that definitional category: is do you get to enjoy the benefits of tax exemption and charitable deduction? If you do these things, the Johnson Amendment says you don't get to enjoy that. It doesn't mean that the pastor goes to prison the next day. This is part of the tax code. Yeah. So I'll say that. In terms of the IRS having to clarify things over the years, and going back to why we need to understand what the law says about political activities and not what popular culture says is a political activity, is that there are a number of things that the IRS has said the Johnson Amendment doesn't touch this. So speaking on issues is generally not prohibited. So I go back to where Andrew started us off. Developing that convictional strategy for a pastor, for a church, is incredibly important, because if you're backing off because you think you're not allowed to speak on these issues that might be considered political, it's not covered by the Johnson Amendment, and you might be missing an opportunity that you're being called into. In terms of candidates, the Johnson Amendment doesn't actually prohibit a church from hosting a candidate, although the church can't show bias, and they have to provide equal access. So there is a necessity that if the activity you're doing with a candidate for office is impliedly endorsing them, then it would be a violation of the Johnson Amendment.
But if they give open access or equal opportunity to all the candidates,
well,
they're probably okay.
Stepping out of the church world, you see this all the time. You see organizations that are nonprofit organizations that qualify under the code, and they're hosting debates. They're hosting there's all kinds of things going on that wouldn't be covered by this prohibition.
Are there circumstances under which a pastor could endorse or oppose a candidate outside of the church?
So this goes to the question of what role is a pastor fulfilling? And the pastor, like any other employee, is not always necessarily speaking on behalf of the church or speaking in his position. Now, my caution would be pastors have enormous influence in their churches and in their communities. So you do want to look at this carefully, but there is a dividing line. And pastors in their personal capacity are not affected by this law that we're talking about. Now, in the age of social media, there are often questions of where that line bleeds together, and I would counsel caution in those things. Those are some of the questions that we get every once in a while in these gray areas that we can help with on the Church and Ministry Alliance team, or can find an allied attorney that might be able to give counsel on that.
So we talked about candidates. I do think we ought to talk briefly about legislation, and whether it's bills or it could be voter initiatives. And I think right now, as we look around the country, there's a lot of states that have really important legislation that they're considering, including one of the things that immediately comes to mind are some of the ballot initiatives regarding abortion, and that may be an area, going back to what Andrew shared earlier, that pastors may really feel strongly about speaking out about. Talk a little bit about, and obviously, you can't discuss or you can't answer every circumstance, but just give some of the very basics about what churches can do when they're talking about specific legislation and some of the lobbying rules that would come into play there.
Yeah, so there's another part in this section of code prior to the Johnson Amendment, which also sort of definitionally excludes an organization from the 501c3 benefits, and that is substantial influence of legislation. So we usually call this lobbying. And that word substantial is sort of the critical part of the question. So it's not a prohibition against lobbying. It's a prohibition against substantial engagement in lobbying. And so I wish I could give you a very clear definition of what was substantial and insubstantial, but there really isn't one. And so it's not really an economic test. It's not really looking across your workforce and see how many of people are putting in time on this. I will default to the, and again, this is related to the tax code. I'll default to the idea that speaking on issues is not prohibited, and it's not typically lobbying. Speaking and calling someone to action on a specific piece of legislation might be lobbying, and it's okay if it's in an insubstantial part of the organization's activity. That's the IRS. Here's where it gets more complicated. That's the IRS view of lobbying. Every state has its own lobbying definitions, and that usually is related to registration requirements. So you have to register as a lobbyist if you engage in this type of activity. Those definitions are all across the board. But if you as a church are trying to launch into something very significant related to one of these ballot initiatives, it's worth talking to someone to think through what that implication could be in your state. this doesn't affect that, but just to complicate things, there's also another federal definition of lobbying in the Lobbying Disclosure Act. It has a lot to do with speaking directly with members of Congress. However, it's a different definition. So you've got 3 definitions in play.
Clear as mud.
Yeah, right. So clarity is right there for you.
Can I follow up on something you said there? I think the ballot initiatives that are slated to happen in Florida are a really helpful kind of cipher to work through how pastors should think through their obligations to speak on this. Earlier, I began by saying I think a pastor should ask, do I have the mandate, the competency, and the jurisdiction to speak on a given issue when it arises in public policy? So you think mandate-wise, you have biblical precedent, clear biblical precedent for human dignity that is pretty clear. Life should be protected at all stages in the eyes of the law. That's pretty clear. A question, do you have competency? Okay, well, you're the pastor. You are called by God to exegete and proclaim the word of God. That, again, is not first and foremost political speech. It's biblical speech that hits upon political issues. So I think there's a way in which you could say the IRS could interpret this as political speech. I think that the pastor can say, well, no, this isn't political speech. This is just Bible speech. Third is that issue of jurisdiction. Here is, do I have the ability to speak to this issue in the lanes where the issue apply? And that's where you have to go back to Genesis and think about, what is Genesis? Genesis is this comprehensive narrative about all of the universe, all of creation, all of global society, meaning that at the very front and center of that question is life and the right to life and the purpose of life. And so if we can't be clear on the significance of protecting life in our law, which, why do we have laws to begin with? To protect the flow of lives living within a political community. So I know there are all of these kind of like legal technicality questions, but at the level of like first principles, this is one of the clearest examples where, as you are coming to texts that hit on creation order doctrines and creation order ethics, I think you have an obligation to speak.
Yeah, and I think it just gets back to, you raised this at the beginning, and that flows exactly from those categories are really helpful. And it's why we're asked to give legal resources and to explain legal regimes on these topics. But I really still feel it's not only the best, theological advice, but legal advice to do that hard work of determining what is God called us to, how do we work through those categories as a church and as an organization. Don't let the law, sort of lead the way and then back into what you're going to say on this. You need to be speaking convictionally. This needs to flow from your sincerely held religious beliefs, and that actually strengthens your legal position as well.
Right. So just to quickly summarize, because I do think this is one that there could be a lot of confusion on, that there is a specific issue, whether it's a ballot initiative, say, like the one in Florida you mentioned, that is come up in a state or in a municipality or whatever level it's at. I think to summarize what you said, their tax-exempt status, a church's tax-exempt status, is not going to be jeopardized by them simply speaking out about that necessarily, because lobbying, there's not a blanket prohibition on lobbying for maintaining your tax-exempt status. It has to rise to the level of substantial, and that's not a clear line, admittedly. But that's where some discussions with an attorney can be helpful. Yeah. But you absolutely are not prohibited from doing that, and is that a fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. And then I think as you get into those gray areas, that's where you'd want to seek some help and advice, and both on the legal side and then also on also thinking through what are we called to in this environment. So, and I want to underscore something you said at the beginning too, is that on some of these things, on whether to engage on certain things, is going to be different for different organizations.
Yeah.
It might look differently, and so again, this isn't just an all call to, hey, you need to engage. It's an all call to think deeply, and to understand the law in light of what you feel God's calling you to, and your organization and the people that you're shepherding in your church.
So, Andrew, I want to go back to you now, because I hear a lot of pastors say they don't necessarily want to tell their congregations how to vote. Mm-hmm. They want to tell them how to think about voting, and particularly as a Christian. So, if the question is, what is a biblical perspective on voting?
Yeah.
How would you answer that?
Sure. So, I mean, I think that the two extremes, if we're thinking about how people can think about voting, is for one to think of voting as like a mirror into one's soul, that your vote says everything that there is to say about you. The other kind of end of the spectrum there is to say, oh, well, it's earthly politics. It doesn't really matter. Who really cares? It's just, you just gotta pick someone or something to make your decision with. I think that's mistaken as well. Where I would kind of press us to think about voting is at the level of our conscience. Our consciences are being formed. The question is, in what direction are our consciences being formed? They're either being formed biblically or they're being formed unbiblically. I don't believe there's a position of neutrality with kind of how we have been made theologically. But then I also think there's the question of, what are you doing when you vote? When you're voting, you're taking your convictions that you hypothetically agree with, but then you're actively working to empower individuals with certain worldviews. So I would subscribe to the idea that there is a higher degree of moral significance when it comes to voting. Voting isn't everything about you. It's certainly not irrelevant or nothing about you, but it is revealing as far as I think about how you are understanding the gravity of the biblical worldview and the authority of the worldview that you're proposing to have as a Christian. So, I mean, you think about this, when you are walking into the voting booth, you are signifying, I'm going to use my agency to put person X or person Y into office. Person X or person Y is going to advocate for a certain set of principles. Those principles on a lot of issues aren't neutral. They're either working us in the direction of the Bible and in the direction of honoring God's created design, or they're working in opposition to it. I would be the person who would want to say, I always want to actively empower only the views and only the candidates that would be working to at least further or at least not impede God's design for creation order. And I know that there are a lot of in-betweens and gray areas about, well, this person doesn't quite line up with where I am on this issue, but that person definitely doesn't line up where I am on this issue. I think that's where, to some extent, a lesser of two evils voting paradigm is somewhat accurate, if only because all candidates are flawed at some level. I've never had a candidate that I've agreed with at every possible convictional degree, but it does mean that a candidate may not share all of your values, but the candidate may also not hate your values as well. But at the end of the day, you're having to make a decision. If you're going to vote, and I think you should vote, what am I going to empower? Are you aware of what you're actively going to empower? And is what you're going to empower working in the direction of biblical faithfulness or in opposition to it?
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. So one more question kind of in this arena.
Yeah.
And that is, we hear this label, Christian nationalism, getting thrown around a lot right now. Like it's sort of the buzzword.
Yeah. Will you just explain to our audience, what is
the term Christian nationalism?
Yeah.
What does it mean and what does it not?
Yeah,
I think
I mean,
equally as important.
Yeah, Tim, it's a great question. I think 90% of the debate around Christian nationalism is purely definitional. And what I mean by that is who is actually using the term. I would not wear the label for myself of Christian nationalist. There are secular reporters who would label me a Christian nationalist, not because I am a Christian nationalist, but because why? Because I am a conservative Christian who wants to bring my conservative Christian convictions into the public square, and that, according to some kind of academics and some of journalist standards, is not allowed. You can't bring your religion into the public square. Separation of church and state, which I affirm separation of church and state. If Christian nationalism means like an actual legal establishment between a church and a state, which that's kind of how I define what Christian nationalism is, I would reject that. But to say that church and state should be institutionally separate is not to say that religion and politics should be separate. Religion informs your ethics informs your politics, and our system of constitutional government absolutely allows for you to speak and to act on the basis of your deeply seated convictions. So again, I think this is just really about who is using the term. I think kind of the progressives every 5 or 10 years are coming up with some new epithet to scapegoat and to kind of blacklist conservative Christians, whether it's Christian right, moral majority, theocrats. I think the latest iteration of this is Christian nationalism. So I think this means that you should be thinking helpfully about the ways that it's right for Christianity to influence the nation. And let me be very clear, I'm very glad that Christianity has influenced our nation's laws. And I can say that while not affirming something like Christian nationalism that is trying to privilege Christianity in law versus other types of religious systems. I think that's where you begin to kind of trickle into those questions that I think our First Amendment is really good at helping set some precedent for.
Right. And it goes back to, and you touched on this earlier, but I think it bears repeating, the notion of the common good, which you have said is really critical to the way Christians understand their political engagement. Just reiterate that idea of the purpose, the difference maybe between promoting the common good versus sort of
Christian nationalism,
favoring Christianity or over other religions.
Yeah. So I mean, you think about what we are called to do by Christ. Numerous places in the Gospels, we are called to love our neighbor as ourselves. Treat others the way you want to be treated. That's a common good ethic. It's a justice ethic. I like to define the common good as merely the love of neighbor in the aggregate. I can't physically go and love every single person in society. I don't know every single person in society. What I can do is to advocate for laws and to advocate for candidates who I think are going to instill the types of laws that are going to best promote every human being's welfare equally. And so as my welfare is being promoted, everyone else's welfare is being equally promoted. I think a common good ethic can be found in Jeremiah 29, when the exiles, or when Israel is exiled off into Babylon. What are they called to do while in exile? They're called to seek the welfare of the city, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Now you dig deeper, you look in Jeremiah 29, what are the actual instructions for how you're to seek the welfare of the city? It's not revolutionary. It is build houses, plant gardens, have families. What is that? That's another way of saying do the creation order type work. And so creation order itself, Genesis 1 and 2 is kind of a creational common good, that God is the author of the nations. All of the laws of the nations are meant to reflect the righteousness and standards of God's holiness. And we believe as Christians that when laws reflect that holiness, human beings are going to prosper as a result of that. And I mean, this is why one of the most important letters in American history, Martin Luther King Jr.'s A Letter from a Birmingham Jail. He says, the reason that these racial supremacy laws are wrong is because they're out of sync with the natural law, they're out of sync with the eternal law. And how do we know that's the case? Because they're doing active harm to our neighbors. This gets back to the question about agency in voting. I don't want to promote policies or personalities or platforms that I think that are going to actively tear down and destroy the well-being of my neighbor. That's where I think you need to pay attention to how your voting can have real-world significance on the common good.
Yeah. So, Don, as we're moving forward after this, and for our churches in the audience, they're wrestling through these things, and they've identified where they want to get engage on these issues. Do they have the opportunity do our Church and Ministry Alliance members have the opportunity to talk to you or our other attorneys on staff about these questions? Because as you pointed out earlier, they're complicated. And I think, if we can develop the clarity on the theological side, but the legal side,
right.
I think getting some support there could be really valuable. So what can they do in that respect?
Yeah, we would definitely invite questions on this issue, and we do get lots of questions related to some of the areas of law we've discussed. We're committed to handling the ones that we can, that we're equipped to handle. We're also equipped with an attorney network that we can help. So some of those specific state type of questions that we brought up. And so I think my encouragement would be, as you hit one of these issues that, as you're coming out of that deep convictional work and saying, this is where God's calling us, and you have a question about the law, we would love to receive that and be able to help you walk through that.
Great. Well, before we wrap things up, is there anything else that either of you would like to share with our audience?
I mean, I really appreciate you being here, Andrew, and I've loved some of the categories you've put out for us to think. The verse that, the thought that comes to mind as we close here is that there's a reason we're doing this now. We're in the middle of another election season. That brings up a lot of questions, not only for churches but just citizens, individuals, and sometimes I think maybe some people thrive off of this, they love it, and other people would like to go to sleep and wake up in February 2025. But I think that the admonition and encouragement I would have for the church and myself is these type of things magnify the witness of the church. These are the seasons where the non-believing world looks and sees if we're willing to live as we tell them we are. And so the verse that comes to mind is from 1 Peter. Be prepared to give an account for the hope that you have, but do so with gentleness and respect. And I think there's a lot of things to take from that.
That's good.
That verse is, first of all, be prepared. I think a lot of this fear and some of the things we've talked about breed silence, breed fading into the background. But in a much, maybe not much, but I would say probably a much more hostile cultural environment that Peter's writing into, he says to the Christians there that are doing that creation order work, he says, be prepared. Be prepared to give an account. And then he says, hope. So we are people of hope. We have to be people of hope in these seasons because we're not defined by election cycles. Yeah. And so we need to bring that hope, which leads to, I think, treating others, our neighbor, with gentleness, with respect, even in the midst of telling hard truths and being prepared to do that. So that's my prayer for myself. I think no other time in history do I feel like these conversations are just right around the corner all the time. And that's my desire as a believer, and that's my prayer for the churches that we get to serve as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would simply, I want to say this. We were talking about this earlier. A few years ago, I got to meet Chuck Colson, and he had written a book called God and Government. And he autographed my book, and he said, "Dear Andrew, love your country, but love your God more, Chuck." And I just have found that to be, still to this day, one of the most adequate summaries for, I think, what a Christian political theology ought to look like. Because what we see in that statement from Colson is that politics isn't everything, but it's also not nothing at the same time. We are aliens and sojourners passing through. I've been reading in my devotions in Hebrews, and it talks about how Abraham was seeking the city that is to come, because the implication is this city is not going to last, okay? That this city may not last doesn't mean that the city is unimportant. Laws have real-world consequence, and nations might want to see themselves as operating in opposition to God's law. God's law has a way of vindicating itself, and nations will either live in accordance with God's laws and prosper, or they will learn the repercussions of violating God's law, and they will suffer. That's why we are ultimately concerned about politics. It's not about seeking a Christian nationalist state. It's not about seeking Christian privilege above any other type of religion. It is, we believe that there is a grain to the universe ordered by God. Laws help reflect the grain of God's universe. We want to say all nations, in some sense, are Babylon in a post-fall Genesis 3, Romans 8 world. But guess what? Babylon still belongs to God. Babylon doesn't get to rewrite the laws of creation. And we, as God's servants, have been given the amazing privilege to advocate for these laws and God's design in the place that he has put us. And we should not reject or be cynical about that, but to see that as an opportunity to reflect God's design and God's glory.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. So thank you, gentlemen, for participating in this conversation. I think it's been very helpful. And if you are interested in digging into these issues more, we have a resource page available for your church that includes a couple of resources specifically on the issues of church and politics, as well as a whole host of other legal and cultural resources for your church. You can access that at the link or through the QR code that's on your screen. And I want to specifically highlight one of those resources, which is one that actually Andrew Walker has drafted, called "The Nations Belong to God, a Christian Guide for Political Engagement." Now, this is a very extensive resource that is set up in the style of a catechism. There's 40 question and answers that dig into a lot of these issues related to the church and politics, and it's incredibly helpful if you're looking to dig deeper into this, particularly on a theological perspective, to have a biblical worldview on politics. And I'm also excited to announce that we have just released our new Church and Ministry Alliance legal guide on churches and politics. That's this one that I'm holding right here. This is available as a members-only resource for the Church and Ministry Alliance, and you can see it there on your screen. So if you're not a member, we would love for you to join. The Church and Ministry Alliance is a membership program of more than 4,200 churches and ministries nationwide. And the program exists to equip and empower gospel-centered churches and ministries to boldly live out their missions and transform our culture with the truth. And as a member, you'll have access to a bunch of different resources like the ones that we've already talked about. Members also receive legal support, news and insights, have opportunities to engage in the broader community of CMA members, and to gain support and other training and resources for their congregants. And to see all these member benefits, as well as pricing for the program, you can visit adfchurchalliance.org/benefits, or you can scan the QR code on your screen. So thank you again for being here and joining in this conversation with us. You are going to get a link to a survey as you're exiting out of the webinar. It will just take a minute to fill out, and it would really help us out if you would take a moment to do that. So please look for that link, fill out that survey, and check out the resources on the page. And again, thank you so much for being here. We hope it's been helpful. We look forward to having you at the next webinar. God bless.